Who's Dr. Stinky McDougal?
You mean the legend?
He's a real buckaroo bonsai kind of guy.
I watched him dice a guy into pieces with 6 f***ing words one time.
Stinky's the most inconvenient man in most rooms.
He's a master of drunk boxing.
Every time Stinky calls, my blood pressure skyrockets!
I heard he's staging an evolution.
Dr. Stinky McDougal says the difference between a revolution and an evolution is the conscious choice not to break everything in the transition.
And now, broadcasting from the borderless territory of Liberty Valley, Minnesota, here's your host, Dr. Stinky McDougal! Shake it, baby!
Welcome to the Dr. Stinky McDougal podcast. Today's guest is Daniel Ice, a friend of mine and a friend of the channel out of LA, California, not far from where they're rebuilding after the fires this last year. And Daniel has had an opportunity to spend some time chatting with me on several subjects. And the reason we have him on the show today is because we want to talk about, fundamentally, what is the nature of reality? And then on top of that, we want to talk more specifically about what is that nature of reality? How has that been used on things like megalithic sites, on explaining our history, on who we are, and what's going on? All of these questions originate from really what you would call the theory of everything. What is the reality of what's going on around us? So welcome to the Dr. Stinky McDougal podcast. Daniel, do you want to say hi to the folks and share a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I have a background in building technology, and I really got interested in kind of alternative research because I don't think a lot of the answers we're given really add up. And I think that a big reason that the past is treated the way it is because once you start to understand how electrical the universe is and the electromagnetic radiation and all that stuff, it really does start to question everything that we've built. The structure of everything. I'm a big fan of Dr. Jack Kruse and his work on the impacts of light on our bodies, non-native EMF, the blue screens, all this kind of stuff. So I think that once we understand our past, we'll start to unlock anti-gravity, unlimited energy, these kind of sci-fi concepts that are probably being repressed from us.
If we start sort of in that question of why they're repressed, so first of all, one of my favorite quotes, if you want to start with the conversation about what is reality, was a quote by Peter Levenda, who pointed out that the word real is cognate with the word royal, and that which is royal is what is real. And so how much of our reality is dictated to us by someone royal, and how much of it is real? What are we really looking at around us?
I like that question a lot. I was watching a mainstream YouTube video on science the other day that a friend sent me, and as I watched it, I enjoyed the observation because he actually did the experiment, and but all of the commentary on top of the video was nonsense, and I think that that's how you start to filter this real versus real, is through personal experience, and becoming a master of what you're experiencing. And we all have been taught to fear ourselves. If you think you know something, it's Dunning-Kruger. And but the reality is, I think the principles of electricity and stuff like that, when you go back to Tesla and Heaviside and all those guys, they were just normal guys in a garage, if you will, doing very dangerous experiments in retrospect. But I think we need to return to that, where science is observation and not a computer model. And I think that the royal model is the math model. And I think a lot of people think that math is somehow this, they treat it as if it's a magical language. But really, math started as English or whatever, French, whatever, and they would write O-N-E, P-L-U-S-E, O-N-E, equals T-W-O. And eventually, the plus became a symbol for reduction. It's a very, I write software, and software has syntax and parsing. And so math is a very strictly typed language with very low levels of variability in how you parse it. And but if I told you because the English proves it, you would look at me like I was nuts. And I think because the math proves it is a very similar statement. Math is more exact and it's a helpful language, but it's not science.
Well, and I like where you're going with that, in particular on the math question, because one of the things that a lot of people talk about our reality being is it being a simulation. And so there should be a complete mathematical relationship to everything around us, which I think is what we have, right? Isn't that kind of what we say, that everything is interconnected in the universe?
It is, and at the same time, I do enjoy a little bit of zodiac. And when you look at history, there's clearly worship of the zodiac, and it's continuing into today. And I think I can prove that pretty simply. We all know there was the Egyptian Apis bull worship during the age of Taurus. Bull worship was wide around the Mediterranean, and that's because they were all, working out of this framework of the astrological signs. Then you get into the shepherd king. In the Bible, you've got King David. He's a shepherd king. You have the weird conversation between Joseph and his family when he's bringing them into Egypt, saying, you're not cattle herders, you're shepherds, you're not cattle herders. Or sorry, I'm saying it backwards. Don't tell them you're shepherds, tell them you're cattle herders. Were there no sheep in Egypt? I doubt it. This is a theological discussion saying you're not shepherd king Aries worshipers, you're Apis bull Taurus worshipers. And what comes after that is Pisces. Obviously, the Christians have the fish. That's Pisces. And now we're all going into the age of Aquarius. And this is calendar talk. I know a lot of people think you're very mystical when you talk about the zodiac. I would just say, and now it's the 1st of May or the 3rd of May or whatever. I'm not invoking anything, but if we had an astrological calendar, I'd just be saying, and now we're in Aquarius. But Aquarius is really linked to technology. Therefore, all of the explanations everybody's coming up is simulation theory. And I think that Aquarius has dictated a technological religion onto the age. And I don't understand it. I can just observe it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Obviously, we've had this explosion of technology on the scene. We have stories of this technology reaching out to us through, these purported holy landed craft of exotic technologies. And so the question that we always sort of look at reality, and I kind of liked when Peter Levenda said this, and Tom DeLonge said this, I think it was in Man or War, that too much of the machine, or maybe it was an interview, but he said, listen, too much of the machine is bleeding through, right? So if we're talking about reality, what does it mean if too much of the machine is bleeding through? Does this mean that we are past a sustainable level of technology in our life and that we have to change that, or that we have to better integrate it? What is that reality integration between the two sides? What does that look like?
I think most of technology requires yin and yang, or positive and negative, because I think fundamentally what everything is, it's the sine wave of EM radiation. And so, EM radiation comes from the sun, primarily in our world, and EM is electromagnetic. And right now, I feel like our technology, if you think about a sine wave, it goes up and down, and part of the time it's spinning the positive and part of the time it's spinning the negative. You could call that breathing, inhale, exhale. And I feel like the path to anti-gravity and the path to unlimited power is learning to exhale, if you will, or learning to inhale, that all of our technology is simply on the positive side, and that 0 point energy they want to access is on the negative side of the sine wave. And so I think what technology is becoming it's becoming becoming toxic. And what is toxic is an excess of something. In the same way that the reason we breathe in and out is CO2 becomes toxic if it's too much, right? But it's part of the exchange cycle there, right? And so I think when we get to 0 point, We won't have all these power lines running around, all the EM radiation. I think we will rebuild a lot of technology over time on, I think even this interview, I'm sitting in front of this blue screen, getting all this blue light. There's kind of no other choice right now. And it's
Right.
not
Yeah.
the
What do
kind
you
of
do about
radiation
this?
yeah. And I think that the, what do you do about it is how every problem is solved. And that most, problems cannot be solved until they manifest. You can't solve something before it's a problem, said another way. And so in the nature of creating the problem, you actually create the solution. And so there's a lot of people working on red light technology. And I think that as those come to market, hopefully combined with Maha, although it's seeming like a dud at this point because he's going after the food and stuff like that. It's good to eat better, don't get me wrong, but the real issue is in healthcare is the centralization of everything. Centralization is also an anti natural principle because everything is decentralized. Our sun is decentralized from others, but decentralized doesn't necessarily mean totally disconnected. And so the machine is bleeding through because we're kind of only using one half of the technology, and we're just breathing in, and we need to learn to exhale or whatever. And of course that will solve a lot of the pollution problems as well.
It's funny because I was at the Minnesota Science Museum Easter Sunday, actually, of all the places I should be. And they have a whole display on what they call fake medicine. And I was really surprised to see that they had a whole display on Oregon, I think that's how you pronounce it, and that entire, what they call scam. And it reminded me that this was also covered, the idea of Oregon was discussed by, I think it was in War with Peter Levenda here, that he brings it back up again. Wilhelm Reich. Is that right? Who did that? So the question then becomes in healthcare, right? Are what you describing is the other side of the sine wave being rediscovered? Is it possible Orgone is real? Is it possible that there is a force that can heal people without needing the medications?
Well, a big part of technology that I work in is solving the problem at the right level in the stack. And that's a techno-babble way. There's psycho-babble, there's techno-babble. But, it's kind of the old thing where are you solving the problem where it's occurring? And so there's 7 layers to a network. The first is the physical connection, and you kind of build up from there, right? And so if you're trying to solve a level 3 problem at level 6 and 7, no amount of tinkering at level 6 and 7 is going to fix the level 3 problem. So
fundamental issues going on.
So the second thing is correct use of technology. There's a lot of people discussing, the Greeks, the pharmacology, all this kind of stuff that's become in vogue in the podcast sphere or whatever, in the zeitgeist. And what's very interesting about the Greek technology and medicine is it is an in and an out. There was a dote and an antidote, a Christ and an antichrist. And Christing was to put something around your eye. And with this, they would give you, in essence, poison. And the poison would bind to the thing that you're trying to remove, and then you had to remove the poison. Oh. And so this eventually gets watered down into leeches. So the knowledge is eventually forgotten. So the leeches were part of the ancient rituals. They would pull things out, but they just forgot all the other stuff. And so what we're living out right now is a very hollow view of the past. The past has been left, and there's just the bones, and people think it was a very mystical time or a very stupid time, or they make fun of, oh, how many leeches and blah blah blah. When people step back from the current present model and understand how harmful our healthcare system is,
it's awful.
Leeches are going to look like nothing. And the problem is that healthcare is built, it's become a control mechanism more than anything, because our health is important to us, and because the abusers of power go to choke points of power. It's not that healthcare is inherently something, but it's been weaponized into a choke point. Think 300 funneling everybody through the thing, right? All they have to do is defeat you in the doctor's office one-on-one with this guy who's got a PhD, he's got a nice car.
And a license that says he can't do anything but what they tell him to do.
Yeah, and then they have the mob running around with their licensing agencies and doing what they do. And and then the justification of the licensing is that the track record of the unlicensed people, such as the exhibit you saw, the propaganda against them, is that, you don't want this to happen to you. But if we were to do an honest accounting of the impact of the current system and stack it against that, I don't think they would fare very well.
No, I think you're absolutely right on that. And I think one of the ways that you can see Peter Levenda's point that too much of the machine is coming through is, you have to imagine that machines create control so that things happen in a very mechanistic sort of way. Not sort of, so they happen very mechanistic. That's why they're very machine-like. And one of the dangers of having too much machine coming through is that when the machine begins making errors, like taking industry executives and making them executives at the FDA, and then taking people from the FDA and making them executives at the drug companies, right? You have that exchange going on. This is when the machine starts breaking down. These are level 2 and level 3 problems you talk about, right? And so people keep trying to apply these level 6 and level 7 solutions to them when people are like, well, look, the solution to the political problem is to add a third political party. No, the problem is political parties to begin with. Right? So the question is often a null set is the answer rather than additional fixes. And people often talk about when a system finally collapses, it collapses because of the sum of all of the errors. So are we seeing a machine that is coming full nature, full circle to the accumulation of errors?
So I think, obviously, live in America, follow American politics. What's very interesting about Trump is the machine was broken and he got in and took over. And he, Edgar suited the Republican Party. And Edgar suiting is, the movie Men in Black. The alien comes down, the farmer checks him out. The farmer goes into the barn. The alien kills him and then wears the guy's skin. His name was Edgar. So Edgar.
Oh,
suit,
the
right?
Edgar, sure, from Men in Black. Got it.
Yeah. And so Trump saw a weak party, jumped into it, and Edgar suited it, took it over, re-imbibed it. And one of the big discussions I've been having with my friends is there is a scaling function in everything. And so individuality scales into groups. And then when you scale into groups are almost always stronger. This week, the 100 men versus a gorilla meme is going around, and
yeah, I've seen this.
And so I haven't even bothered to watch it. Don't care, but it is an important thing of group versus individual is the point. And the strongest individual is almost always crushed by the group. And what I think the path forward is the scaling of individuals, and then a hybrid group individual think where the point of the group is to defend the individual, and versus the opposite. And abuse happens when the individuals serve the group. So you discover sex abuse in the church and you expose it, and it would bring the church down. So they cover it up, and the individual is eaten by the machine. And it's not the church only. It's the Boy Scouts, it's the Girl Scouts, it's your local school, it's your organization, it's the department head doesn't want to take the fall. And so this self-serving group, rather, groups should serve the individuals, not the other way around. And so, this is what happens. This is what corruption looks like in group dynamics. And at the same time, a world without groups would be unscalable. You can only hold 100 people in your head. You have to start at some point. People zoom out into groups. Just the same way you get perspective when you drive down a long road and the mountains get closer and farther at some point, this is a scaling function of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that just thinking that someday groups will be this, someday groups will be that, there's no someday. History is a series of actions, that reshape the structure of things. So there are always going to be people doing those things. But I think one of the interesting things is through technology, you can allow the capabilities of an individual to get larger than any time before. And at the same time, more people need to do that to be independent. Independence needs to be on the rise because we've become too centralized. And nature is both centralized and decentralized. It tends to centralize around an individual, and it tends to decentralize from there. But anyhow.
Mm-hmm. No, you're making some really excellent points. One of the things that it brings to mind is the orientation of the individual in what's happening right now. And to your point, the idea of the group serving the individual rather than the individual serving the group, because that is really sort of the functional danger of government, right? The original problem that the Christians presented to the Roman Empire was not that they were out there being politically active and rallying against Caesar. The problem was they were in the street doing everything that Caesar said he was supposed to be doing. And so, it was an example of individuals freely grouping together around an idea to improve the lives of individuals, right? Rather than the state.
Boy, I love that. I mean, Imagine if people started growing healing remedies in their backyard and getting into the sun.
We could get rid of most of the pharmaceuticals with just some free weed, man. A couple psychedelics. We could do a whole lot of good in the world.
That's the danger, though, is non-revenue generating paths to solutions. And in China, they fear the group so much that there's I think it's called Qigong or something of that. It's basically a form of I would say yoga and meditation where you take various poses, and there's no belief in a higher power or anything. In fact, the only real organization to it is these are the poses. And if you practice Qigong, they're going to arrest you because there were so many people doing something that the party couldn't control.
And it brings up a really interesting point. You blew my mind. I'll share this with everybody. I'll put a picture of the post up here real quick for folks. But you blew my mind a couple days ago when you sent this to me. But it was when I asked the question, when we look at these megalithic structures that are all over the world, I can see the nature of their construction as defined by mythology, right? For example, the description of the building of Nan-Madol has the building of an altar to agriculture, and then once that's done, dragons are released, and the dragons are what create Nan-Madol. And so we have at least some sort of firsthand description, although we don't understand what it means. That's just kind of that first part. And we have that very simple description, and that's all we can really go on. So let me think for a moment where we were going with this point was...
So I was just saying that the Chinese government can't stand any groups.
There we go. And so I'm wondering that if some of the creation around these sites doesn't begin with understanding, as you put it out in the quote in the post, thank you very much, that although there may be a machine aspect to this, there has to be a human, and that some of these poses may represent the manipulation of that world around them. Do you want to talk about that idea? Share that with me.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, my favorite part of every movie is the beginning when they craft the lore of the world. So, you come in and it says in the beginning, and they start telling you about the world, and they're zooming in, and they're kind of whatever the thing is, whatever the story is, and I love beginnings. I work in startups as well, so there's a little bit of alignment there, and the fact is, how you tell the beginning of the story often dictates what you think. So we always hear, like, in the beginning, there was a lot more magic and all this kind of stuff, right? And there's this sense that we're losing magic as we go through history, and that history is going from a place of magic down to primitiveness, and then it seems to be magic is replaced ultimately by technology.
Realism.
And
yes.
Realism, and we're getting real. So I think, though, that all the magic ultimately is electromagnetism. And I think that if the Earth was in a different electrical state, and I think when you look at how the Earth follows the sun and the sun moves up and down on the galactic plane. So we all know that the sun's here, and then we have a plane of planets, they're all aligned. Well, the stars in the Milky Way tend to align into a similar thing. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing is we're bobbing in the sine wave, because the sun looks like an electron moving on a wire.
That 11-year flipping.
This creates the 26,000 year, solar calendar, or the calendar of the zodiac, where the North Pole points to a different point, or the where the sun rises and all that kind of stuff. So the sun is moving through things, and I think at different cycles in this cycle, or at different points in this cycle, there's a lot more energy on the Earth, and these are the golden ages of history. And I think that these machines that are built here worked differently during different times of the Earth's level of electricity. And so this is the sense that we're losing all the electricity, right?
I would really agree with that, because when we look at this has often been pointed out, is that you have these megalithic stones with perfect shaping on the bottom, and then you seem to have an intermediate stone. It's still a very large stone for someone to move in some sites, in many sites. It's not as big, but clearly it was set later, and then you have these individual stones eventually stacked on top as repair jobs. And so clearly something changed, either in access to the technology or access to enough energy to do it. The base stones at Baalbek being one of the best examples.
Yeah, and I think Baalbek is interesting, just to rant on that a little bit, because I think that the original stones were cast. And there's a guy, he goes by @FauxHuman. I think he's out of Hungary, on X, Twitter. And he is working on learning how to recast. He believes that all the stones were basically chemical, advanced geopolymers. Advanced concrete. And he thinks that the nubs that everybody's so hung up on are basically a way to vent water, drain the water while the stone sets and cures. And he's recreated this at his house, in a pot, and he's been able to make geopolymers of similar quality and stuff. And but I think that it's important that you think about it, because we have basic electrical components that we all know. We all know that we have, conductors, semiconductors, and insulators, right? That's kind of the basic there. Insulators could be called capacitors. And what you have is, that the limestone and the quartz, or the quartz in the limestone and the quartz in the granite, often act as dielectrics. And not a lot of people understand or talk about what a dielectric is, but it is basically a capacitor. And when you strike it, it releases the electrical energy. And so when you go to this new discovery with the pyramids, whether it's real or not, it actually makes a lot of sense. Because what would happen is these deep pillars down would give it the space to be whacked by a lot of the water coming from the Nile, which would act as a water hammer. And that would be able to water hammer. And so that's what's striking the pyramid to generate the electricity. And Ken Wheeler is very interesting. He's got an alternate physics that I tend to agree with.
The conceptual default, and we like to pigeonhole things like ice, water, and steam, are all, of course, water, one thing only, different modality expressions of one molecule, i.e. water. Same is true of magnetism and dielectricity. To refer to magnetism, this word, magnetism, relative to dielectricity, is like talking about ice versus water. Magnetism, I will be very simple and make this video very simple for people to wrap their minds around it. You'll be the first people in the face of this earth to understand the most fundamental force in the universe, that magnetism is actuality, yeah? Where dielectricity is potentiality. The loss of potentiality manifests in actuality. So magnetism would be analogously ice or steam, take your pick, and dielectricity would be the fundamental substrate, i.e. water. Don't take that analogy too far, but magnetism is the dielectric field. In other words, the extrinsic attributional manifestation, the loss of that potentiality, which manifests as actuality. Kind of like a log in my log-burning stove up in the cabin is a piece of potentiality. You know, it contains within it, that log, the potential to create heat if you burn it. So the actual flames emitted from the log would be the actuality or the magnetism, and the log itself before being burned would be the potentiality. That's making it really simple. By the way, a field is just an ether perturbation modality, and magnetism is the dielectric field, the extrinsic attribute, i.e. the actuality of the loss of energy of what is potential. Loss of energy potentiality manifests as one thing and one thing only all throughout nature, and that is actuality. A magnet is a point source object. Yeah, point source objects are the source of every fundamental thing that we enjoy in technology.
And his explanation of what the pyramids were is that they would generate an electrical stream that would stimulate and basically create a aurora borealis over the pyramids. And he's pretty anti-supernatural. He's very like scientific, and so he doesn't go down a lot of this stuff. But when you combine some of the stuff that, you know, Cliff Hyas said that there were gonds, and these gonds were kind of similar to your theory of Rapa Nui or Easter Island, is they would create these high pressure systems around them that would allow people to live an enhanced health life.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, it could be that the Great Pyramid of Giza is the biggest of the gonds that was there. And so when you have the limestone casing, this acts as the insulator, and then you have some granite inside of there, and then you have these the overall structure though is a piezoelectric. Piezoelectric is another term for dielectricity. And we've all used a piezoelectric if we've ever lit like a lighter. And what it has is a little piece of quartz inside, and the striker hits the quartz. I mean, not all lighters, but most cheap Bic lighters will hit that, and that will unleash a spark of electricity that will then ignite the fuel. So that's how it works. But the pyramids seem to be, you know, something related to that. They definitely weren't tombs.
Yeah, I think you're. Yeah, they definitely weren't tombs. Although, you know, I always find it interesting that they build these tombs around. And the question one might have is whether there is some sort of amplification event. You know, did people always die in these, or did people get put into these until they quit healing people, and then they eventually just became places to die? You know?
Well, and we really don't know, you know, what's on the other side, right? Like
right.
We have theories and you know, but they could have sent people to the other side, and I think if you really sit deeply with if I could take a detour to explain, you know, kind of my model of physics and how it impacts what I think is going on. So you start, and if you understand the electromagnetic spectrum, it really starts with radio waves, which are about the size of a building, and they're doing this big oscillation, right? So how many times does this wave go up and down in, you know, 1 second, right? And so the Earth, you know, has the Schumann resonance. So the Earth is actually vibrating at, I think, around 8 hertz or 7.3 or something like that. But it goes up and down, you know, 8 times a second. And so then the radio waves get tighter. And as they get tighter, they become microwaves, and then they become infrared, infra being below red. And then you hit the visible light spectrum with red being the bottom, so infrared. And then you hit ultraviolet, violet being the highest of it, so above violet. And then it goes into X-rays, and then it goes into gamma rays, and eventually it collapses into hydrogen. And all matter is a compound of hydrogen.
I heard that. Did I hear? Was it you said that recently, or someone said that recently? Because if everything
Hopefully,
begins as
many
hydrogen,
people are saying it.
yeah, because that would make perfect sense to my theory on solar system formation, in that the Z-pinch puts out a molecule or an atom, and if everything were based off of a single atom and that atom were hydrogen, that would make perfect sense. It's the simplest, slightly positively charged, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, I'm still working on charge. I have
Yeah.
but I love that you brought up Z-pinch, because the next character in the story is a Z-pinch, because what forces something to be matter, and what it is it's kind of like when you get a current in the river, because the river narrows and the rocks are there and you got good whitewater rapids and all that kind of stuff. So the Z-pinch is the narrowing. And so what's narrowing? Well, it's Hera. It's all the female gods. That's magnetism, right? And so magnetism wraps around electricity, and magnetism is a big part of what's creating that Z-pinch. And so when it's pinched, but the amount of energy coming through, it pressure mediates and upscales density into matter. So this is where matter comes from. Matter is, in essence, pressure mediated light. But the big thing that I haven't mentioned is, what is waving? A wave is not a thing. It's a thing that something does. And so the medium in which waves happen is ether. It's what classically is called ether. And the ether was not disproven by Morse and Marley or whatever that classic experiment in the 1890s was. That was a point of the machine taking over the narrative and observation being thrown to the side. It disproved a specific kind of ether, which was the view of ether at the time, was that ether was entirely static, a grid, almost like when you go to a computer game and you see that grid there. The grid is always there. In computer games, the grid's always there. You can't, you're always at some position in the grid. And that's kind of how they viewed ether. And what the Morse and Marley experiment tried to do was, we all know you go in the convertible, you put the top down, you feel the wind, because the air is there and you're moving at an accelerated rate through the air, and that's what causes the effect of feeling like there's wind. They thought that the planet itself was doing the same thing through a static ether. And but if you actually rotate their experiment by 90 degrees, it works, because they were aligned, and it proves ether. They were aligned 90 degrees out of phase, because they were measuring, one direction. If you turn it the other way, because
you're not measuring the electric field, you're measuring the magnetic field. You have to turn
exactly. So so anyhow, you have ether. Ether is perturbated, which is kind of like the big guy jumping in the pool. He perturbates the water, and he sends the water in a wave. The water doesn't become a wave, the water waves. And so the ether is waving, and when the ether waves at a certain frequency, we call that light, visible light.
So if we're describing ether as something that moves things, just to stop for a moment, because this is, so one of my passions is sailing. And I have this experience when I was very young. We had a cabin in northern Door County, Wisconsin, and one afternoon, I don't know if it was June or July or August, probably August, because we were in the water. The lake, or the Green Bay side itself, the bay actually faced straight north, but that bay that day had no wind-drawn whitecaps on it, but it had 3-foot waves. Like, and there was, you would think there would be, there must be a big storm someplace. I mean, well, yeah, but you don't get these kind of waves from this. These were huge. So what you're saying is that the field of ether is what's moving the wave itself. It's a perturbation within the ether, and not a wave creation through it. It's the water itself is waving as ether is waving. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much. If you think about the guy jumping in the pool or dropping a rock, the serene picture of dropping the rock falls, it splashes in, and this is Ken Wheeler's analogy, I like to give credit where it comes from. The rock falls in, it perturbates waves. The water hitting the shore is not the water that was moved by the rock. It's the water but the energy radiates out. This is, and so the sun is basically vibrating like this in space, and it's vibrating in a pool of ether. And the ether then allows the radiation or the sunlight or the EMF, to radiate through the ether, right? So it perturbates through the ether, and then it increases in density. And so when it gets to the point where there's a Z pinch or high pressure or more energy, what happens to water when it has more force than the concrete wall? Well, it chips a little concrete off every time, right? And we understand enough water will wipe everything out, right? So this is the scalar function of waves, is that waves in low energy do low things, and waves in high energy, and high and low are relative, because the reason that the waves take the shape they take is because they are seeking to pressure mediate the energy from one system to the other, so that we arrive like we have, been drinking my coffee, right?
Yeah.
I don't put the coffee down and have the coffee get hotter and hotter and hotter. The wave energy of coffee, of heat, is perturbating outwards, and it will achieve room temperature. And so that is a pressure mediation system. And I think pressure mediation is probably a way of saying the ancient term balance. And so what you have is you have multiple tiers of pressure mediation, and pressure mediation, as the density of ether increases, creates different physical properties. So the pressure mediation of heat takes you from gas to liquid to solid, right? And really, we should talk about all four of the classic forms: plasma, gas, liquid, solid. And we'd say earth, water, air, fire. Fire is plasma. So there's a hollow version of an ancient term, or a modernization of an ancient term: plasma to fire. Fire is low energy plasma. That's what it is.
Yeah, no, I always like to tell people, listen, everything in the universe is just made up of energy, and that trees are just stored energy. They're just stored light. What do you mean they're just stored light?
But they're also stored. They're also stored in the shape of light.
Yeah. Oh, in the shape of light, really? Because they're clearly a positive. Well, I mean, trees have a lot of shapes, but they're all a fractal example of an electrical charge. But share a little more about the shape of light, because I hadn't heard of the shape of light being a Lichtenberg fractal.
Yeah. So Lichtenberg fractals are actually maps of pressure density from my perspective.
Oh, okay.
And so what I mean by that is, in fact, the video I referenced earlier where the observations were good, but the commentary was nonsense, was why does electricity follow a non-straight path to complete a circuit? When you have a spark gap, why will the spark go out of its way? And so they would show like a spark gapping between things, and then they would put a piece of different materials, and it would spark onto that material, and in essence make the path between the two sides longer to find a more conductive material. So and that's because if you look at there is another principle, which is conservation of energy. Obviously, we know that from physics, but that is manifested in pressure mediation. But if you only understand pressure mediation as distance, that's an incorrect thing. So the reason that conductive materials conduct electricity is because they create the most pressure aligned path for the circuit to be completed. Even if the distance is greater, the distance is measured by pressure is minimal. And so what the Lichtenberg patterns are is they are revealing the internal pressure states of things, and they're going down those pressure states. So that's why it's creating this, and people are like, oh, it's a search pattern or whatever. No, this is the local state of your etheric pressure.
Yeah, this is how rivers are created. You know, you just listen, take a kid outside, get a bunch of dust together, put some water in one end and watch it go. And that's just the nature of pressure differentiation coming to equilibrium. And it's one of the things that I love about the river systems of the world. And especially when you look at waterfalls. I had this realization one day. I was like, boy, these waterfalls got to make sense. And, there's a lot of pressure. And then there was a pressure change. It created a density hole, and then it jacked up where it needed less pressure, and it kept going. It was looking for the next path of least resistance as its need was satisfied. And that's why rivers go up. But I think one of the things that's interesting to point in the other direction, because I think this is also the heart of why things like the pyramids are misunderstood. We all want to say that the water's direction was seeking low pressure, but isn't it true rather that the low pressure is pulling it towards itself? Which is, or is there a fundamental? Could it be both?
Which is a question, as I said earlier, of charge. Yeah. And you said, doesn't hydrogen have like a positive charge and stuff?
Slightly positive.
And okay, so the other thing that I get from Ken Wheeler is that there's no such thing as a straight line in nature. And that's because Ken Wheeler's model of electromagnetism is basically, if you think of a donut, that's magnetism. And a donut's a toroid, if you want to use, good sacred geometry language.
I'll throw it up on the screen.
And the donut is rotating like this. It's rotating. And that rotation creates a vortex or a suction down, because the rotation creates a low pressure system. And so low pressure actually is whichever this is, convex. Yes, vex is out. And high pressure is actually, imagine you're stuffing plates down on a stack of plates. That's creating a concave amount of force, right? Because it's like weighing it down. Mm-hmm. And so that is actually why the two, high and low, are balancing. So I think high pressure is pushing into low pressure, because you get out of concavity by becoming convex, and the convexity accepts the concavity. And this is the basic nature of everything. Male and female, right? One accepts the other, and so, but that's the shape of the donut, and then the donut creates this spiral. But when the spiral hits the elliptical plane, or the plane of inertia, as Ken calls it, or in the solar system, all the planets are on that plane, because that plane is where things are balanced, right? Mm-hmm. It spits out the other side and it becomes a opposite vortex. We all know if you flush the toilets in the northern and southern hemispheres, they change, and that's because of this principle here.
And I really like his explanation that in the middle of the vortex is the hourglass shape that we see. And when he said that, I went, now I get the opposite, the two shapes that are formed, positive, negative, if there were, because I think he doesn't like polarities either. But those were that explain the two shapes of magnetism to me that I hadn't considered, because there's the rotation of the field around the current, and then there's the toroid around the Z-pinch. Correct?
Mm-hmm. The toroid basically creates the Z-pinch. But yes. Now take two hourglasses, because this is a single cell in a circuit. So how does the circuit become coaxial? Well, at some point, that cone that's going outward on the bottom loses inertia and starts to collapse backwards. So you kind of spiral out and you hit the maximum point for your energy, and then you start to spiral in, creates another donut. So you end up with, in essence, imagine two pyramids stacked. So the circuits connect, donut stacked on top of donut, which creates that, which then if you get into, talking about the conspiracy theory world, or the world of alternate research, you get into Terrence Howard. And Terrence Howard, his big thing is he calls it a linchpin. And what he did is he took the flower of life and he superimposed it into 3D. And the gaps between the spheres of the flower of life create this negative space, which is the linchpin, which I see as these two convex spinning cones, right? And so it's really interesting because you have to consider negative space. So you have positive and negative space, and now you start to see what I was saying earlier about the breathing in and the breathing out.
Is this where physics is stumped at this point, that they're too busy only looking at the positive space?
So physics is stuck in what I've heard the term gritology. And so there's two models of physics. There is the Tesla model, which I think you have people like Ken Wheeler who have extended it beyond Tesla, who've just picked up the ball and run with it. And then there's the Einsteinian gritology model. And gritology is, I think Minecraft is probably the simplest way to understand it. In Minecraft, the basic unit of existence is a block, right? And you have these little blocks, and the blocks all stack up. And because in the Minecraft world, everything is a block, everything looks blocky, right? Because our basic unit, I believe, is this donut with the hourglass. That's why you have a lot of curves in nature. This is like when, everybody's looking on Mars for signs of life and everything. There are no straight lines in nature, right?
Right.
Well, and that's true because nature doesn't flow energy in straight lines. It flows it in sine waves. And so the sine waves, you're never going to have something smooth. You're never going to go to the desert, which is an interaction of, the wind wave energy and a solid, matter, and find a perfectly smooth, bit of sand, right? Unless you find that perfectly smooth sand in a very, very low windy spot. But eventually the waves come and the whole thing turns into sand dunes, right? Yeah, maybe you'll find a smooth spot here. But if you look at the level at which the wind is working, it creates the sand dunes, right? It creates the wave structure. And it doesn't create straight line structure because the pressure is not mediated through straight lines. And so with the gritology model, because everything's stacking up, this is why they're always looking for where the mass is and stuff. And they're exploding the particles and trying to find the Higgs boson and all that stuff. And they can never find the mass. And that's because the mass shows up as a function of the pressure mediation system. It's not something that's there. And this really ties back to the holographic nature of the universe. Is the universe is basically pressure mediated into existence because the Z pinch of the star starts spitting out the hydrogen, and then what you have is increasing levels of density from there. And so the more and more dense, the different ways the EMF radiation and vibration and these things start to happen. So why do buildings crumble at earthquakes? They crumble because the wave energy comes into them. They have a low vibration ability, right? So because of that, they will split into segments that allow them to vibrate up and down, because the pressure mediation function must return a response, if you will, within a certain time. So the amount of energy coming into the system has to be mediated by tearing it or collapsing it. So yeah.
This is really, I like where you went here, because I want to jump to another comment that you sent to me one day that it just kind of blew my mind on this thought. I had long concluded that the Earth must have continued to increase in density as the size of the creatures on it decreased. And there was a Thunderbolts piece with Ted Holden that talked about this, that, look, you couldn't create the Brontosaurus on Earth today. There's just no way to pump that much blood that high up. The Earth must have had a lower density, whatever gravity is. Yeah. And you came to me and said, hey, have you ever thought about the idea that what we're looking at in these densities is much like a source code, and the density of a source code beginning from, 2 megabytes to a 4 to an 8 to a 16 to, right? So do you think that that's what's you kind of circle back to the beginning here. Do you think that's part of what's happening in our experience of the world? Are we just experiencing greater and greater density of experience?
Yeah, I definitely think that. I don't know that it always has to go to greater. Sometimes it goes to lesser. But I also think the things that are getting denser are different. Like right now, we have too much density in groups, and groups have created high pressure systems that we call oppression. And so that pressure needs to be mediated back into the individual. And but also on an interpersonal level, we have a high pressure system or an excess of individuality so that we can't engage in community. And so these are what balances on one level doesn't necessarily balance on the other level. But I think that this is where the Mandelbrot set comes in. And the Mandelbrot set, I think, is a beautiful mathematical picture. And I know I said, like, don't do science, don't do math. I'm not saying math is a useful tool, but math is not science, was my point there. But in terms of the Mandelbrot set, it's a recursive pattern that creates a very interesting pattern, and you can spiral in and in, kind of like these bottles here in my background. That you can see the start of the bottle here, and then it would spiral outwards and stuff like that.
I'll stick some Mandelbrot work in the window here for us.
Yeah, everything in the Mandelbrot set is either in one of three states. It's either inside the Mandelbrot set, it's outside the Mandelbrot set, or there's the edge that defines between the two. And you can call that an emergent property. And if you want to watch some great videos and some very clear thinking on this, there's a Fractal Woman YouTube channel. She dives into this very deeply. And the thing about it is we often have these big debates, free will versus determinism, right? Well, if you're standing on that line of the Mandelbrot set, which I think is where life is, and you look inside the Mandelbrot set, you're in the inner part of it, everything is deterministic. If you turn around, the outside of the Mandelbrot set is unbound for infinity, and that is openness and free will. And so a lot of times, you know, if you're in a closed system, determinism makes the most sense. If you're in an open system, free will is the answer. And life is really sitting on the edge of both, you know, and in essence, it's zero on my sine wave, up and down, right? Mm-hmm. And now the thing about the Mandelbrot is if you leave kind of a ghosting effect of like where the line was, you start to see this beautiful color patterns. And that's what they're doing, is they're running it a lot of times and leaving a ghosting pattern of where the line was. And so multiple Mandelbrot sets can recurse and recurse and recurse. And that's when you level up in dimensionality. And so as you get density, the patterns get more and more complicated. But everything is a scaling function. When that level is saturated, when ether gets saturated, it becomes air. When air gets saturated, it becomes water, or liquid. When liquid saturates, it becomes solid. And when solid becomes saturated, you run out of magnetism to balance the ether, and that becomes a black hole, and the ether gets released backwards. And so the sun and black holes are opposite of each other. So the black hole is where things leave the materium and go back into this neutral state.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that you brought to mind here has to do with Buddy James's work on the Doherty set. And you know, your thoughts here on the Mandelbrot set are just, one of the things that I've come across recently is this divide in the type of life that has occurred in the Indonesian archipelago. There's a specific place where on one side you get a whole different set of animals than you get on the other side, which speaks to, if you will, almost perfectly speaks to your point of the Mandelbrot and the compression of reality. It just startles me. Is it possible what we're looking at is that the physical reality is defined by the Doherty set, but that the life set is the Mandelbrot set? Is it possible there are two sets going on? Is that a functional way to look at it?
So this is where I'll reference Ken Wheeler again. Ultimately, there is only one substance of everything. There really can't be more than two substances, or we would have more manifestations of that. Like everything reduces down to ether. It's not, and you can solve it by reducing it down to ether. If you couldn't reduce it all down to ether, then you probably would be looking at two prima facie substances, or like base core elements, if you will. And so I tend to think that there are, mountains and stuff like that do create basically pressure mediation differences that the mountain itself is bearing. In the same way that a bowl holds water or a cup holds water, as long as that solid thing is there, it's going to hold the level below it in check. So I think when you have these physiological divides, and maybe the electrical nature of everything on one side caused a certain form of life to grow, and maybe over here, because I was just looking at this crazy guy on YouTube who makes ice cream out of tree flowers, and there's this one flower that I think it's a type of pear tree, and the pear tree evolved to emit the smell of rotting meat to attract flies, because it's pollinated by flies instead of bees. And so the flowers smell like rotting meat. And so that is a way to pressure mediate, and it's a yin to the yang, it's a 1 to the 0. Like, we're used to flowers smelling good because primary pollinators are bees, but what if we pollinated through flies? That's what that would look like.
I want to stop for a second on that comment of the yin and yang, because that's where my mind was actually before this. So when we're back on the conversation about reality, what is the nature of everything around us? And I was thinking about this last week. Do we have to recreate the model, or is it already encoded in ancient symbolism, things like the swastika and the yin and yang? And if so, none of those, begin, or the yin and the yang can't exist without the other. And so is that representative in and of itself of a single whole, where the ether represents the one end of pressure and the electrical universe represents the other, that they are just the two ends of the same manifestation?
Yeah, but I think the other side of existence is the spirit world. And one of the things that Fractal Woman talks about and Ken Wheeler talks about is the term incommensurability. And I may have mispronounced that, but incommensurability means that two things are entirely not the other. So to be one thing is to not be the other. And so the Mandelbrot represents incommensurability the best, because either you are inside of it or you're outside of it. If you're inside of it, you're not outside of it. And you could think of this simply as domains in math, or sets in math. So I have set number 1 is the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Set number 2 is 4, 5, and 6. These are incommensurable domains. They have no overlap. If set 1 was 1, 2, 3, and set 2 was 3, 4, or 5, then 3 would be a commensurate or an overlapping of things. You can think of Venn diagrams. You got two circles, and then there's no overlap here, right? So these are all helpful analogies, but ultimately at the base level, ether is one side of the spirit realm. It's the physical side of the spirit. And so what's happening in the spirit world, I think, is the cause of what's causing the ripples in the ether. And the interesting thing is it's not that they gain energy, it's that nature is so efficient, it compresses and compresses and compresses that stuff, right? And
I like the idea that the observer is primary, right? Without us, nothing has happened, right? There is no record of anything real without the observer.
I think the observer is the state of the materium after the ether is propagated through. So we are the observer of the eons of Earth's existence, however long Earth has been here.
Right.
And so I do think the observer thing, a lot of it is that they don't understand that consciousness See, we're that dot of black and the white and the yin yang, or or however you look at it, whichever side we're on. But the human is the antenna to the consciousness. So we actually are the line between the two in the Mandelbrot. And so we're the antenna that picks up consciousness. And this is why, nobody knows where stuff is stored. The gritologist, everything, believes that everything stacks up and at the top of the pyramid is consciousness. I tend to think that the consciousness of God thought reality into existence, and that's what we call Birkeland currents or giant electrical waves. I think that God's thoughts ripple through the materium and it eventually manifests in that way. It manifests into everything.
I like to look at it as a whole note. I actually thought about making a video one day and just having it just cheekily be, what is the nature of reality? And you'd start the video, and on the video would just be this black screen, in the middle would just be a whole note going, ah, and that whole note is all of reality occurring at once. It's the whole of everything.
Well, and it says that God sang creation into existence.
Yeah, it's also biblically correct. I always tell people, look, take this stuff literally. We're not trying hard enough if you don't take it literally.
Yeah, and you get into cymatics, and then the other thing that I think is a giveaway. It's not that we're in a simulator; it's that we have basically a very simple physics engine, and that's the pressure mediation of the toroid and the hourglass. And what's really interesting, and the thing that blew my mind, was your work on the chaos circuit, and showing how the chaos circuit has the four quadrants, and Ken Wheeler also has the four forces too. And so
has Ken talked about the memristor? Because if he is, I definitely want to watch that.
He is not. This is me linking
I see what you're saying. Okay.
And what I'm saying is, what do you have over here? You have magnetism, and magnetism is the storage of charge in the magnetic field. And then you can shift the storage of charge into the electric field with the dielectric. And the changing of those two, or the reconciliation of the pressure mediation, is electricity.
I believe you just described memory, right?
Well, and then no. And then memory is actually gravity. And so his four forces are magnetism, electricity, dielectricity, and gravity. And so I think gravity is the memristor in this analogy.
Yeah, it's the thing that both it has to be, because it both attracts you and it repels you. It remembers how much you weighed, and it applies enough force back up in order to equalize the system.
All those meals,
right?
Well, then you overlay it with Jack Kruse, who basically believes that all life, and especially human life, is a semiconductor fab to do photosynthesis, or to do the conversion of light into energy, and that through that light matter that creates electricity in our body, which is what powers your mitochondria. And the mitochondria are the engine inside of your cell. And then he shows how we have self-producing light inside of our body.
So years ago, probably back in the early 90s, I think it was, I saw a story of a gentleman from India who went 88 days. I believe he drank some water, but the only thing he did, he didn't eat, he only looked directly at the sun to sustain himself. And, it's, some people go, well, Bob, you don't know whether to believe these things. Is he making it up? I mean, really, you didn't eat for 88 days. You'd be blind if you did that type of stuff. But I often reflect on that when I consider how little we know of physics and how little we know about the human body. And, we know now at a quantum level that plants store energy, sunlight, in physical matter. That's how a plant grows. And yeah, so within us then is that same degree of light, is what you're saying, is that we are just encapsulated life in movement, or light in movement? Is that a...
Well, yes, but at a much, much higher density. And so there's three kinds of semiconductors in nature. The first is all well known. It's chlorophyll, and that's a non-controversial position. We all know that chlorophyll is a sunlight-based or a photoreceptor, right? And we all learned it in class. It, you know, makes the sugar and takes the carbon dioxide out of the air and you know, all that kind of stuff, right? The second semiconductor is hemoglobin, which is of course in your red blood cells. And this was a big advancement in nature that allowed there to be more electricity. What happened with more electricity? You got things that could move. So plants actually have all the things we do. They grow, they move. They don't move much, but we've all seen the videos, time lapse of the plant growing towards the sunlight. They also sing. There's people that have been able to record plants singing and stuff like that. So they have, you know, expression and stuff like that. They make a humming. There is a level of consciousness to them as well, and there's a couple of great books about that. But the hemoglobin allowed us to scale up those things, and then finally, the most complete and best semiconductor out there is melanin. This thing that everybody seems to fight about on density levels. And so melanin is all throughout your body. A lot of people think that we hear because we've got little bones and they vibrate and our brain interprets the vibrations. But the reality is the cochlear, which is that snail looking thing in your ear, is full of melanin. And the reason that we can hear so beautifully is because the melanin actually is a semiconductor, and it is an analog to digital converter, and it sends electrical impulses to the brain from that cochlear, because the amount of lag you would have if we waited for bones and physical transmissions is too slow. We hear on an electrical speed. We do not hear on an analog physical speed. And so that should tell everybody a lot of things. Then if you get into it, there's a book called The Body Electric by blanking on his name, but The Body Electric, Becker, Robert O. Becker, The Body Electric. And he is where Cruz kind of got a lot of his thinking from. And this guy was hired by the military to figure out how to regenerate limbs on, if you've killed your economy for mommy, if you're in battle and you need to regenerate limbs. And so he studied the salamander, because the salamander, you can cut them off and they grow back. And how does that work? And we're theoretically related to salamanders if you go far enough back. But he basically found that they had electrical impulses that allowed them to do that. And we could theoretically activate those. But then he started saying, well, if it's electricity that's driving the salamander, what are all these power lines, all these microwaves and radio waves doing to us? And he asked the wrong questions, and he got edited out of scientific history, even though he was probably had the best quantum understanding of what's actually going. And so when you asked me earlier about the substances and can we do that, I think for the most part, ultimately the end result of health will be light machines, and that can reprogram us based on light. Now that's entirely terrifying, because once we have that, we can only imagine what the pharmaceuticals will do if that kind of mindset is applied with that kind of technology. Now, but I think that ultimately the story of the guy staring into the sun for 80 days, there's another myth. And I don't use myth in the sense of the derogatory way that it's been used. Myth is history encapsulated in a very long lasting, format, because myths carry much, much further than specific details. But the ritual was to go sit in a cave in the dark with a blindfold on for 30 days. And then on the 30th day to come out at the point of sunlight, and the sun would come up and you would stare at it, and it would basically reset your body. And they would take you up and pull the blindfold off and hold your face to look at the sun. And then all of your skin would fall, your hair would fall out. Sorry, your skin would go ashen, and you would go back in the cave and and your body would reboot basically. And this was practiced by a line of shaman that would live a very, very long time. So they would do like a full system reboot. So I think it would be possible for us to live on light. It is kind of but at the same time, part of the reason that the guy had to sit there like a plant was because it doesn't produce enough energy to live a normal life.
Right.
So you have to spend so much time, kind of plugged in that, and so this is where food and other nutrients come in, is they in essence are a battery recharge, just like in a video game you're eating, and the little hearts come back. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I got Kitty here. As I began to get into the electric universe model of the whole thing, I began to realize that, life is just the accumulation for larger animals, the accumulation of additional nutrition, which was just additional captured light, right? So the cow eats the grass and then stores the energy, and then we eat the cow and eat the stored energy from the grass.
And the other really interesting thing that Cruz talks about, and I agree with what you're saying, is that's why they're like batteries. They're like edible batteries.
Yeah.
And what Cruz says though is ultimately what happens is your cells are creating energy by creating deuterium, which is hydrogen rich water or heavy water. And I'm still working through his stuff, so I'm a little fuzzy, but I can't remember if we start with normal water and make deuterium water or the other way, but he shows on a cellular level, basically water is that battery that's water is the electrical battery that we're working through. And then you go back to these machines we've been talking about. What's really interesting about all the machines, the Oracle, Delphi, Rapa Nui, and the pyramids, is they're all by water.
Yeah, and it's got to be an exchange of salt water and fresh water.
And they all end up creating fresh water.
Yeah.
And I think that these machines also popped up after the apocalypse, because what was the pressure mediation to deal with all of the external electrical energy that came into the earth? It was to salinate the oceans. And so a lot of that energy, I think, was stored in the ocean in the form of salt.
Right.
And so then they said, oh, there's salt there. And they had some sort of electrical understanding that we can build these machines that will convert the salt into fresh water. And I think that that's what's going on. We drink electrolytes, we have the fresh water and the sunlight and the photosynthesis. And so we're running that same program.
Mm-hmm. I tell you what, we're going to take about another 5 or 10 minutes here before we wrap up. Is there a topic du jour that you'd like to chat about?
Yeah, I think that we've talked a lot about the machines. I think you've done a lot of great research lately on the machines with your Oracle Delphi series. And I think that the reason that archaeologists are blind to machines is the same reason that archaeologists are not engineers. They have a look at their thing there, and they don't see the machine. They see a lot. They're training. They look at it through that lens. But I think that our comprehension is only as good as our model. And so I think this is why the interdisciplinary types. I think of there's the guy with the Land of Chem, and he's I forget his name, but he's done some really great research showing the pyramids are probably chemical plants as well. And he shows the different chambers. He's gone into the chambers, scraped the walls, shown that these are multi-stage chemical plants. So I think that the ancient world is much more machine than we realize. But machines.
I'm sorry. Just because you're on the point of machines creating these chemicals, one of the strangest things about Rapa Nui is that it appeared to what's the word I'm looking for? It seemed to reinvigorate the soil. Like it had a natural process of re-engineering. What's the word I'm looking for? And they were like, yeah, it's just like a machine. This thing would relayer in the nutrients it needed for the next year, and it almost seemed like it was machine-like as a process that it just created.
Well, that's because all the nutrients that the system needed were basically being concentrated by the Rapa Nui machine onto the island. So they literally, an island should not be able to be replenished, right? Like theoretically, you're kind of draining it down. And so that's kind of the paradox of that. So clearly, they got to a level where they were able to replenish a lot of things. And that's why they struggle now. Now that that machine's broken, it's really hard to hold the population there. It's really hard to do a lot of those kinds of things. But I think that I think that as we get a better understanding of the physics and stuff like that, the machines will make more sense. I think that we can only understand what we can fathom or comprehend. And I think that our comprehension is so based on gritology and not ethereal dynamics that none of the things seem related if you're in grit, because you're just stacking a bunch of Lego bricks up and they got stacked in that order, whatever. But if you see it as pressure mediation through etheric densities and stuff like that, and then, the thing that I've been wanting to ask you forever is you keep alluding to there was no metal then. And I don't see how anybody looks at metal and a lot of the mining that you do, and it's all electrical pattern. What's the pattern that lightning goes in? The Lichtenberg. All the veins of gold are Lichtenberg patterns. And this idea that gold is somehow the dust of an exploded star, and like a bunch of stars blew up and then Earth gets there. Why did stars explode and then all the patterns appear in veins on our planet? It makes no sense. It does make sense if gold is pressure mediated high voltage storage from a giant lightning, a cosmic thunderbolt, if you will.
Well, I like the idea, which we already know is true in today's solar wind. I like the idea that a little bit of all of the elements were released. We've found, if you can believe the stone hammer found in rock, if you can believe that that's a pre-apocalypse relic, and there's also a picture of a wheel in stone, right? I would imagine there's got to be something in there, so we can talk about there being a use of a type of at least rudimentary technology. And I mean, if the hammer's to be believed, they had metal. But I don't believe that it was as common an element as you or I might find today in the veins. I believe the veins probably transmuted to a degree, but I also believe that because they're because they're metal, they were drawn electromagnetically into a vibration in that area. Right?
Yeah, and I think I tend to agree, and I think that was probably from earlier apocalypse. That maybe pre-human.
Yeah, exactly.
And
as the density increased, each density offered a layer of something new.
Yeah, and this idea that you put, the native peoples have of the god stood there and he stirred the hole and he poured earth in, clay, pour some water, clay and water. That's the epochs of the earth growing like a tree ring.
Yeah.
When we were in the womb of Saturn, the cosmic egg, all that kind of stuff.
Creation story.
The Ute creation.
I love that guy because if you look really close, he's got a swastika on his neck in a medallion, which is it's part of the creation story itself.
But what's a swastika? A swastika is the downward spiral through the cone or the hourglass. It's showing that there's a vortex. And the vortex is what moves everything. That's what creates life. It's, and so they understood the vortex nature. And I think a big way that they got there is they saw this much more chaotic and electrical world that we lived in back then, because we were at a different point in the cycle, or the solar system was in a different order or whatever, but they were watching the electricity happen.
Yeah, no doubt.
And then they would go there and there would be lodestone, metal, magnetism, and I tend to think they also, one of the things I really like about the faux human guy who's on the path of figuring out stones and geopolymers, he has a very plausible explanation for how they discovered it, which is you burn trees to create the chemicals that you need to create water glass, which basically and if you think about where do you have a fire pit and you burn a ton of trees and then it rains on that, and then all of a sudden these weird rocks are forming in the ash, right?
Right.
And so they started to see that, and then they started taking the ash and mixing it with things, and that's how they ended up at the geopolymers. And I tend to think that's a pretty realistic path on how we could have developed it. And so I think that when we take away all the distractions of our knowledge and we're forced to interface directly with nature, we tend to create very different types of innovation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that, it's, and this is, I think, where we're at in history with everything. I mean, the flood of new things coming out has just been, stunning. But I think we're at one of these right angle moments in time, right, where we're going to fundamentally change our understanding of something, and it's going to unlock an entirely new age of healthcare, of geopolymers, of construction, right, a whole host of them. And it really is. It's just an exciting time to be around with so many changes occurring as we're beginning to have access to information and knowledge that we didn't have before.
Absolutely. And, I think I think this model of etheric pressure mediation is a very helpful one for understanding things. Like, why did they live in the caves? Well, they understood that the earth was so electrically toxic that they had to go live in caves. And, they took the steps needed to be preserved. And the question is, are we going to do the same thing? Are we going to figure out how to let our technology keep from killing us? But I think that's why all of our movies, they all end up in this like Terminator style, Matrix, technology is like consuming us rather than the other way around. And I think it's because we don't know how to let the technology breathe. So it's just building up toxicity, and these are just like proximal labels and stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like toxic is a super saturation of something beyond its ability.
Yeah, it kills the host. That's the problem with it. And that's also, one of the things that when I look around at what's going on and all of the things that are, there's a reason that you have these truth commissions occurring in Washington, D.C., that you have these transformational, risky moves being made by our president, why we have these revelations. Hey, guess what, guys? It turns out that red dye might not have been as good for you as you thought. What? Fluoride causes cognitive decline? Who knew? Right? And so we're going to have to acknowledge a lot of these really uncomfortable things all at once as a Band-Aid ripoff. And, sometimes I think I'm overly trite with some of these things, but I want to know what people are, how are you going to feel when you realize Adolf Hitler didn't die at the end of World War II? And you think, well, I don't really care. And no, you should, because he still had followers. They're still out there today. We're dealing with a different level of fascism in the world than anybody believes. There are other things going on. And it's, when people begin to comprehend these larger realities that they're encompassed in, that they don't know are occurring, I'm still just barely below water on an iceberg that goes a mile deep.
I mean, yeah, I understand we're trying to wrap up on time, but on a personal level, what people are going to have to deal with is what I dealt with, which is the betrayal of an institution that you have been raised to trust. And so I was betrayed by the church through uncovering sexual abuse, and then having it covered up, and then having myself excommunicated because I didn't accept the cover up. And ultimately, that's kind of the path I see everybody on, and maybe I'm projecting my own experience onto reality, but people are uncovering the truth. They've been poisoning us. They've been doing this all for profit. We are in a fascist state. Why lie about Hitler? Why let him get away? Like, we had these documents. We knew where he was. We could have, Osama bin Laden to him, SEAL Team 6, and that would have been a great story. But at the same time, it would have shattered the institutional narrative. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, the only thing that is going to break is the institution. And humanity will still be here.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan in the idea that the lie becomes the mortal enemy of the state, and that is about as apt a description as where we are in history right now as you can get.
Yeah, and so I think people are going to have to learn to process the trauma of betrayal. And I think that we should have betrayal processing rituals that develop where we can both simultaneously acknowledge that this is an institution that has betrayed us, and some people were part of it, but not a part of it. And by virtue of showing up and paying our taxes or giving our tithe or whatever the way that the institution extracts money from you, by funding this institution through compliance and economically, that we were both a part and a victim of it. And it's not about shame and guilt, because a lot of times causality is linked to shame and guilt. And it's about acknowledging that this institution became so corrupt that it was willing to consume everybody.
That is that was an outstanding set of statements, because it really is just true. You have to process these things. And in our current environment, there is no way to process them, because you cannot explain. People will not accept that which risks the stability that they have otherwise whilst being abused. And this was one of the things that I realized. I didn't come to Christianity until I was probably 10 or 11, so I wasn't indoctrinated from a late age. I actually came into it sort of intellectually. Like, for some reason, I knew not to lie when they presented me the Bible. But my sister used to like to do that to me. But, but at the same time, over time, I always, kind of held this thing, look, there seems to be something important here. People sure seem to be talking about it. And so, at a certain point, though, you start realizing parts of your life are filled with just stories. The idea of money is just a fictional story. The idea of government is just a fictional story. They are just ways that we are managed rather than managing ourselves. And that's back to the individual. And so it was a fantastic statement. And on that statement, I am going to thank you so much, Daniel. Any last things you want to say here today before we say goodbye?
Thanks for having me. I loved it.
This has been a lot of fun. We'll do this again. Absolutely. Absolutely. And keep sending me your ideas, because every time you do, you blow my mind. All right. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget to catch my latest video coming up, and peace out.